Okay, we are starting chapter 13, which is the last chapter in the book, and it's called Merry Christmas, Everybody in the Whole World. And remember, it's been settled that they will stay with the Campbells and that Uncle John will pay for anything they need. And everybody was happy at the end of chapter 12. And so now we've come a whole year. Remember, the book started at Christmas time. And so now it's Christmas again. And I bet it will be a very different Christmas than the first one that we read about. It was Christmas Eve. Big snowflakes fluttered slowly through the air like white feathers and made all of Heavenly Valley smooth and white and quiet and beautiful. I just had a thought. And that's exactly how chapter 1 started. Exact same words, so we have really come full circle. That's really interesting. Tall fir trees stood up to their knees in the snow, and their outstretched hands were heaped with it. Those that were bare of leaves wore soft white fur on their scrawny, reaching arms, and all the stumps and low bushes had been turned into fat, white cupcakes. Mrs. Campbell sat in the rocking chair by the stove in the kitchen, putting the finishing touches on Plum's angel costume. Nancy's was on the ironing board, ready to be pressed. As Mrs. Campbell worked, she hummed and rocked and took care that Penny's 3 kittens, who were playing around her feet, didn't get under the rockers. Mr. Campbell came up on the back porch, stamped the snow off his boots, took off his cap and banged it against the house, slipped off his gloves and slapped them together, then took the broom and swept off the top of his boots and his knees. He came into the warm kitchen, hung his jacket, cap, and mittens behind the stove, and said to Mrs. Campbell, "Well, that's a load off my mind. Plum's Christmas present got here right on schedule. A beautiful little black filly with a white star on her forehead. I named her Noelle. Nellie is so proud she is ready to bust." Mrs. Campbell said, "Oh, Angus, how wonderful! Born Christmas Eve and named Noelle. Plum will love that, and just think, a horse of her very own. Well, I have Nancy's present all wrapped. I thought for a while I'd never finish ironing those little clothes. I certainly hope that I'm not just imagining that she will like the lady doll and trunk of clothes that my grandmother had when she was a little girl. The doll is still very pretty with real hair, eyelashes, and eyebrows, but the clothes are so old-fashioned, hoop skirts, and so many petticoats." Mr. Campbell said, "You know Nancy will like that doll better than anything in the whole world. She'll like it because it is old-fashioned and because it has a trunk full of clothes." Mrs. Campbell said, "Well, I certainly hope so. My heavens, that doll has everything. Little fans, necklaces, capes, bonnets, mitts, parasols, and dozens of petticoats and dresses. And that trunk is almost full size. Don't you think the girls should be back by now?" Mr. Campbell said, "Oh, they'll be along any minute. Cutting your first Christmas tree is a very important job and takes lots of picking and choosing. What are you making there?" Mrs. Campbell said, "Plum's angel costume for the program at the schoolhouse. Nancy's is all finished. See?" She held up the long white satin dress and stretched out the gauzy wings. Mr. Campbell said, "Gosh, Marianne, that's beautiful." He fingered the satin and said, "Where did you ever get such fine goods?" Mrs. Campbell snapped off a thread between her teeth and said, "My wedding dress, that's where. For weeks those children have been talking about the program and their angel costumes, and for weeks I've been racking my brain trying to figure out what to make them out of. Then day before yesterday, I was up in the attic rummaging around in the old trunks, and I came across my wedding dress, all wrapped in tissue paper and certainly as useless as a white elephant. I took it out and looked at it, and I confess, Angus, I got very sentimental thinking about that day in June, 15 years ago. Then I said to myself, 'Listen, Mary Ann Campbell, one wedding is all you're ever going to have, and what earthly use to you is all that white satin and veiling?' Right then and there I knew what I was going to do." Mr. Campbell leaned down and kissed her cheek and said, "I think angel costumes are the best use for your wedding dress I've ever heard of. What bothers me, Mary Ann, is the fact that this will be Nancy and Plum's first Christmas, and I'm afraid we haven't enough for them. They know we don't have much money, But after all, they are only children and undoubtedly expect all kinds of miracles. Mrs. Campbell said, I've thought of the same thing a million times, but I have decided that to Nancy and Plum, the most wonderful thing of all is that they have a home and a family on Christmas. Stuffing the turkey, getting and trimming their own Christmas tree, going to the school program in the sleigh, and these angel costumes, having old Tom and Miss Waverly for Christmas dinner, the presents they had Uncle John buy for the other children at Mrs. Monday's, are the important things to these children, not expensive gifts. Anyway, I sent away and got them each a pair of party shoes, and I have made them each a new dress. Plum's is cherry red velveteen, and Nancy's is sky blue. I also got plenty of little things for their stockings. Mr. Campbell said, so did I. There was a loud knocking on the door. Thinking it was the children, Mrs. Campbell quickly gathered up the angel costumes and hid them under her apron. Mr. Campbell opened the door. It wasn't Nancy and Plum. It was Danby, Uncle John's chauffeur, standing on the porch beside two beautiful sleds and a huge box. Come in, Mrs. Campbell said. But Danby said no. Oh, excuse me. He'd left his car down the road, and he had a big load of packages to deliver to Mrs. Monday's. Oh, Danby, said Aunt Mary Ann, did Mr. Remsen get everything on the list? Got the list right here, said Danby, pulling off one of his heavy woolen gloves with his teeth and fumbling in his inside pocket. When he found it, he read it off to Mrs. Campbell. Eunice, large girl doll, blonde girls, blue eyes, real eyelashes and eyebrows, blue coat and bonnet with fur, nightgown, bathrobe, bedroom slippers, 4 school dresses, 2 pinafores, 2 party dresses, ski suit, skis, roller skating costume, roller skates, ice skating costume, ice skates, Girl Scout uniform, campfire girl uniform, ballet dress, toe shoes, cowgirl girl set, 2 sweaters, play coat, jeans, plaid shirt. Now I wonder, are all those for Eunice or for the doll? I don't know. Alan, electric train, large size with lots of tunnels, signals, stations, switches. Todd, same. David, same. Tommy, cowboy suit, 2-gun holster with guns, lariat, real cowboy boots, hat, pocket knife with 5 blades. Mary, cowgirl outfit, 2-gun holster with guns, lariat, real cowboy boots, hat, pocket knife with 5 blades. Sally, same. Evangeline, same. The rest of the little boys had sleds and new mittens, a cap and a sweater, and all the children big candy canes, books, large boxes of crayons, and coloring books. When Danby finished, the Campbells said, "Oh, Danby, how wonderful! What a thrilling Christmas this will be for those poor little souls. Imagine that poor little David getting nothing but 2 suits of long underwear last Christmas." Danby said, "Mr. Remsen told me to deliver the boxes to old Tom and have him distribute the gifts. They are all wrapped real fancy." "How wonderful," said Mrs. Campbell. And I wonder why he's not giving them to Mrs. Monday. "All the credit goes to Nancy and Plum," Mr. Campbell said. "If they weren't such unselfish children, they could have had all that money spent on presents for them." "Oh," said Danby, "their uncle said that he appreciated their unselfishness, but he just sent along these sleds and this box for them. Well, I must get along. Mr. Remsen told me to give any of the kids that wanted and were going home a ride to the city." "How nice," said Mrs. Campbell, "and how much pleasanter than riding on the train with Mrs. Monday and that horrid little Marybelle. Well, a Merry, Merry Christmas to you, Danby, and thank you so much for driving way out here in the snow." "'Twasn't anything," Danby said. "Merry Christmas to y'all, too," he called as he hurried down the steps and disappeared into the snowstorm. "Just wait until Nancy and Plum hear that Uncle John got everything on that list. They'll be the happiest children in Heavenly Valley. Now, Angus, you hurry and put on your jacket and take those sleds down to the barn and hide them. I'll just see what's in this other box." Mr. Campbell slipped on his jacket, grabbed up the sleds, and ran down to the barn. As he opened the door, he could hear Nancy and Plum's voices down the lane. Mrs. Campbell spread newspapers on the floor, brought in the huge box, and cut the strings. As she raised the lid, Yards and yards of white tissue paper fell to the floor. Carefully, she reached in and lifted out first a beautiful little dark green coat trimmed with gray squirrel, a darling little hat, and a gray squirrel muff. "For my Nancy," she said, her eyes bright with happiness. Then a beautiful little bright red coat trimmed with gray squirrel, a darling little hat, and a gray squirrel muff. "For my Plum," Mrs. Campbell said, a smile lighting up her whole face. Then black patent leather party shoes, silk socks, heaps of lacy underwear, and 2 party dresses with the fullest, whirliest skirts ever made. Dark green taffeta for Nancy, dark blue taffeta for Plum. There were also 2 packages for old Tom, one a very large box, 2 beautifully wrapped silver and green packages for Miss Waverly, and to Aunt Mary Ann's astonishment, a small box marked Mrs. Campbell, from a very grateful Mr. Remsen, and a small box marked Mr. Campbell, from a very grateful Mr. Remsen. My goodness, what a Christmas this is going to be," she said. Then, hearing Nancy and Plum on the back porch, she grabbed up the packages for old Tom, Miss Waverly, Angus and herself, and stuffed them in the front hall coat closet, snatched up all the clothes, ran upstairs, and laid them out on the girls' bed. When she came down, Mr. Campbell had set the box on the back porch and was helping Nancy and Plum put up their tree. Both children had snow on their caps, their shoulders, their mittens and galoshes, and had tracked big gobs of it into the parlor. But Mrs. Campbell hugged them, kissed their cold pink cheeks, and said, "What a beautiful tree!" Plum said, "We walked for about 100 miles looking for a perfect one." Nancy said, "See, this one even has little cones on it." Mr. Campbell said, "I've got the standard all ready. While you take off your wraps and brush the snow off you, I'll put it up. Then you can decorate it." Nancy said, "Oh, Plum, look how much snow we brought in, and on the clean floor, too." Mrs. Campbell said, "Nobody can bring in a Christmas tree without tracking in a little snow. Now go out on the porch and sweep each other off and hurry, because I've got to put up your hair in curlers." As soon as the back door closed, she told Mr. Campbell about the beautiful new clothes Uncle John had sent. Mr. Campbell said, "Golly, that's fine, Mary Ann, but what about the dresses and new shoes you have for them?" Mrs. Campbell said, "I'll just not say anything about them, and then a little later on, when these shoes have gotten kind of scuffy and they've worn their new dresses quite a few times, I'll bring mine out." Mr. Campbell said, "Sure, that's a fine idea. I think that 2 pairs of new party shoes right now would be too much for Plum anyhow. Probably send her out of her head." They both laughed. As soon as Nancy and Plum had hung their coats, caps, and mittens behind the stove to dry, Mrs. Campbell put their hair up in curlers, then sent them up to their room to see the surprise. They racketed up the stairs like streaks. Then Mr. and Mrs. Campbell, who were following, heard loud ohs and ahs and squeals of pure delight. When the Campbells reached their room, the children were trying on the new coats, hats, and muffs. Plum looked in the mirror and said, "Wow, I look just like a princess, even with these curlers in my hair." And there they are. Nancy stood quietly stroking her muff. Mrs. Campbell said, "Isn't the coat beautiful, Nancy? And it fits just perfectly." Nancy said, "Oh, Aunt Mary Ann, I'm so happy I feel funny. I keep thinking, all this can't be happening to me. Pretty soon I'll wake up and know that it was only another one of my dreams." Plum said, "Wow, Nancy, come and look how full the skirts on our party dresses are. And new party shoes! I didn't even see them before. Oh, Nancy, Nancy, look! Black patent leather slippers, just like Maribel's." Plum held one of the slippers up and rubbed its smooth shininess against her cheek. Nancy picked up her slippers carefully as though they were crown jewels, stroked the toes, felt the straps, and her lips trembled as she said, "I just don't think I could hold any more happiness right now. My heart feels like it's going to burst." Mrs. Campbell hugged her and said, "Well, I don't want you bursting and spoiling your new coat, but I've got 2 more surprises for you. The first is that Danby drove in a few minutes ago to tell us that Uncle John got every single thing on the list and he's delivering them to old Tom right now. He couldn't wait to see you because he had to get the presents to the boarding home before Mrs. Monday and the children left for the train. Did he get Goodness's doll and the clothes? Nancy asked. Exactly as you ordered it, Mrs. Campbell said. And the electric trains, Plum said. All three of them, Mrs. Campbell said. Oh, wow, Plum said. I almost wish I was over there just so I could see their faces. It wouldn't do you any good to be there, Mrs. Campbell said, because Danby is going to take as many of the children as he can into town in his car, and they won't even know about the presents until he drops them off at their home. That's when they'll Then, when they get out, he'll give them the present. What about the ones who have to go on the train? Plum asked. Old Tom is putting their presents with their suitcases, Aunt Marianne said. Oh, poor Eunice will have to go on the train, Nancy said, because her aunt lives way beyond the city. She won't care, though, when she sees that doll. What about the presents for old Tom, the electric lantern, and the new Mackinaw? Plum asked. I've got 'em right downstairs in the coat closet, said Mrs. Campbell. We'll give them to him when he comes for dinner tomorrow. What about the violet things for Miss Waverly? Nancy asked. The perfume and bath salts and soap and all. Also in the hall closet, said Aunt Marianne. Not only that, but your Uncle John sent a present for Uncle Angus and one for me. Now enough talking. You girls go downstairs and start trimming the tree, and I'll get my other surprise ready. My goodness, we'll have to hurry too. I've supper to get. You have baths to take. We'll have to leave here by 7, and it's almost 5 o'clock right now. And I'm going to stop right in the middle of chapter 13. But man, talk about dreams coming true. They have hit the jackpot, I'd say. What a wonderful Christmas they are going to have.